Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome. My name is Jessica Shea. I work at Old Mission Santa Barbara, and I would like to welcome all of you to the second of 3 talks in our third annual virtual speaker series. This year series is Climate Change, Caring for Our Common Home. Before we begin this evening, I would like to acknowledge that here in Santa Barbara, we are on the ancestral homelands of the Chumash people who have lived here for thousands of years. A reminder that all attendees are on mute and video screens are turned off. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our website. If you have any questions for our speaker, please enter them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and they will be visible to the speaker, the moderator, and the host. This program is free and will be available online. If you would like to support this program and educational programs like it, you can make a contribution. A link will be going out to you afterward. Of course, this is completely optional, and we greatly appreciate you being here this evening and hopefully on next Wednesday's final talk, as we discuss aspects of one of the most pressing issues of our time, climate change. As a Franciscan organization, Old Mission Santa Barbara is hosting this speaker series in the tradition of St. Francis, who taught his followers to care for Mother Earth and all creation. Our moderator for this evening is Father Ryan Thornton. Father Ryan studied philosophy and classics at Harvard before entering the Franciscan order. He has a PhD in economic and social history. He currently serves at St. Mark's University Parish at UC Santa Barbara. I will turn the program over to Father Ryan, who will introduce our speaker this evening, Brother Keith Douglas Warner, and will lead the Q&A afterward. Father Ryan?
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome to you all. Brother Keith Douglas Warner serves as Special Assistant for Renewal Initiatives for the U.S. Franciscan Friars. As the Friars, Franciscans in the United States, form one administrative entity called a province, he is charged with reminding us that it's not merely a restructuring that we're engaged in, but a renewal for our life. He's also the director of the Franciscan Renewal Project at the Franciscan School of Theology at the University of San Diego. He's worked extensively with social enterprises and Catholic religious orders in Africa in order to advance the UN Sustainability Development Goals in the spirit of Laudato Si, which will be a major theme of his talk this evening. He is also the co-author of a book entitled Care for Creation, a Franciscan Spirituality of the Earth. More personally, I've known Brother Keith since my own entry into the order. He has shared with me much wisdom over these years, and I have no doubt that he will do even more so tonight. Brother Keith, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Ryan. Good evening, everyone. So tonight I want to talk about Laudato Si and its program for moral renewal as we confront the multiple crises facing our Earth. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis proposes that the human family undertake a journey into ecological education and ecological spirituality, what we might call ecological consciousness. So this journey would invite us to a ecological conversion and a socio-ecological transformation to renew our understanding of ourselves in relation to others and in relationship to Earth and to God. Pope Francis calls for profound change in our perception of the natural world and our dependence upon it, in our understanding of the Earth and its ecosystems and the damage that we humans are doing to it, in our lifestyles and the effects that those have, especially on the poor and those who are unable to provide for themselves, and in the transformation of our institutions such as markets and governments. To effect this social transformation, Pope Francis calls for the moral renewal of humanity. He wrote, "Many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all who need to change. A great cultural, spiritual, and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out on the long path of renewal." The ecological conversion that he calls for takes seriously our moral obligation to eradicate poverty and to restore the balance of Earth's ecosystems. He calls for the protection of biodiversity, of water systems, and our climate systems. He also makes clear that we don't have two separate problems of global poverty and climate disruption. Rather, we have one problem, one global crisis with interlocking parts, and we can't address one fully without addressing the other. This is a bold proposal by Pope Francis. He defines the very grave risks we face as a human family, identifies the religious resources that can guide us in this renewal for this ecological transformation, and proposes how we might walk this journey of transformation together. He proposes a different framing to these challenges, one we typically hear about in public sphere today. And he calls for everyone in society, all people, to take up this challenge. This encyclical, Laudato Si, is true to his name, Pope Francis, who invoked Saint Francis of Assisi, the founder of our religious order of 800 years past, as an inspiration for him in addressing these issues in this way. This is the most Franciscan papal encyclical ever written. 800 years, the most. I'm making that as a claim. I'm open to people challenging me on that, but here's why I say that. It invokes St. Francis and his example more than 10 times. The topical themes, the framing of the moral problems, and the methodology of addressing them are all very strongly influenced by the Franciscan school within the broader Catholic tradition. This is a journey of conversion. His understanding of conversion is not instantaneous, but rather a developmental process through time. Pope Francis addressed this document to everyone all around the world, not just Catholics. And there's good evidence that it is the most influential papal encyclical or teaching document ever written. Unfortunately, it's extremely influential, more so outside of the Catholic Church than within, for reasons that have to do with some of the fissures within the US Catholic Church especially. But this framing of the problem and the need for this kind of moral renewal of humanity and the transformation of society and its structures has been welcomed by many leaders in efforts to try to protect our earth and to eradicate poverty. So this encyclical has much to teach us today. The challenge is that it be better known and better understood. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more about here this evening. And to do that, I want to begin at the end, because the sixth chapter, the final chapter, in my view, is the most valuable. And although every chapter is valuable, the sixth chapter really presents this program of ecological consciousness and ecological spirituality as a journey in the clearest way. And this is really, as far as I can tell, the first papal encyclical that's ever even used the word spirituality in a chapter title. And so the very fact that he's addressing it to everyone and calling for a journey of education and spirituality that would result in a shift in our consciousness, I think is really, well, it's quite striking to me. And at the very least, I hope that you might read chapter 6 and decide that on your own as a result of this little presentation. So these title words, ecological education and spirituality. Let's talk about the title words. What does spirituality mean? Spirituality can be understood as best as a lived religious experience. That's my simple definition for gum-chewing Catholics and other believers. Simple, easy, memorable, lived religious experience. It's different than theology, which is understanding of God and God's activity in the world. It's different than philosophy, but it has to do with the inherent religious dimension of our humanity and understanding what that is. So other people use these words as describing spirituality. Consciousness, awareness of oneself in relationship with the world around oneself, or awareness. That seems a little basic, but especially when we're talking here about ecological spirituality, we can also really say it's about ecological consciousness, because the invitation in this term is to become aware of our interdependent relationship with all of Earth's, with all of the creatures, living and mineral around us. And so the invitation is to go on a journey of developing this consciousness, this awareness. And so Pope Francis says eco-spirituality is for everyone, not just Catholics. And so that's an invitation to you. How can you be more aware, more conscious in your own journey into ecological consciousness? Again, from the encyclical, Pope Francis writes, "We lack an awareness of our common origin, our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shared with everyone. This basic awareness would enable the development of new convictions, attitudes, and forms of life." So I like that description, again, at the beginning of chapter 6, because it really sort of talks about there's spirituality, consciousness, awareness, journey, interdependence. I think it's a very nice little way of describing this and presenting it as a vision for everyone. So, as I said, chapter 6 is really a journey. It's presented as a kind of a program for us to follow in a kind of general, again, he's addressing everyone in the world, so it's kind of hard to give everyone advice at the same time, but he is proposing this as maybe a series of self-discoveries or discoveries of our relationship with God and others and creation. It's about developing that awareness, and he's proposing some fundamental components that would be good for all of us to consider in terms of our own spiritual journey. So he defines the journey in the following way. First of all, it's to foster an awareness of ourself as dependent upon Mother Earth. This is really fundamental to ecological spirituality, and it is our behavior at a broad social level that ignores our relationship and dependence upon Earth. That is, has to be addressed first. Secondly, he invites us to turn away from consumerism and embrace a simple and sober lifestyle in relationship to others. So there's awareness, turning away from consumerism. Third, he identifies a stage as turning away from fear, narcissism, indifference, and denial. This is one of the parts, this thematic is one of the most helpful parts of this encyclical, because Pope Francis names these as spiritual problems: fear, narcissism, indifference, and denial. He writes earlier in the encyclical, obstructionist attitudes, even on the part of believers, can range from denial to the problem of indifference, nonchalant resignation, or blind confidence in technical solutions. We require a new and universal solidarity. And so to overcome these negative human behaviors, he proposes that we be open to nature, allow nature to nurture us and our spirit, and to grow in our awareness. Fourth step in this journey is to embrace an environmental ethics program for ourselves and others. And so for this, he points to the Earth Charter, which is a global effort, popular, I must say, more so outside the United States than within, that is presenting basic moral principles that are rooted in the science of ecology about how we can live in such a way that respects justice to current generations, justice to future generations, and respect for the life forms, other forms of life themselves, that they may live on our planet with us. And so this Earth Charter was developed in a participatory way in the aftermath of the Rio 1992 conference, but it's a kind of a universal ethical program that I think is more popular in Latin America. And I think that before he became Pope, Pope Francis heard about it and used it in perhaps in Buenos Aires or in Argentina, or he heard about it from other bishops in Latin America. So I think just the fact that he's saying we need environmental ethics and we need to incorporate them into our life and moral vision, that's a part of this journey into ecological spirituality. Fifth point is ecological education. And in this, he says that education, this needs to be more than just science education. Science education about the earth is very important, but it also needs to probe deeper. It needs to question our progress myths that we place so much hope in. Technology and economic growth will save us. He says, no, that's part of what the ecological education is, to see how that's not true, how that's false and an illusion. And we need to interrogate and set aside false myths. He describes ecological education as taking place in a myriad of locations, not only in formal institutions, but in families, in communities, in companies, in faith community settings. It needs to be practice-based. In other words, not only theorizing about ethics, but actually putting them into practice and acquiring them as we can grow in ethics by practicing the virtues. He writes, Pope Francis writes, education and environmental responsibility can encourage ways of acting which directly and significantly affect the world around us, such as avoiding the use of plastic and paper, reducing water consumption, separating refuse, cooking only what can be reasonably consumed, showing care for other human beings, using public transport or carpooling, planting trees, turning off unnecessary lights, any number of other practices. All of these reflect a generous and worthy creativity, which brings out the best in human beings. Now, I have to say, and I think Brian will agree with me, like the Pope is getting down and dirty. He's getting very specific in his practices. And he's not saying you need to do these religious practices. He's saying that these are ethical practices for the entire human family to consider. And the thing is that people can't say they can do nothing. That's part of what his statement is, his argument is like, no one can say there's nothing they can do. It may be small, but small things can lead to greater things. And again, overcoming these really negative attitudes which paralyze us, the fear, the narcissism, the indifference, the denial, those all prevent us from going on this journey into ecological spirituality. These actions are, from an environmental ethics perspective, the development of a virtue. And one of the fundamental truths about virtue ethics is you don't develop them by thinking about them, you develop them by living them out and through a kind of an experimental trial and error process. So all of these steps that I've been talking about, he then says the point of them, the goal, not necessarily an end point, but the purpose is to foster ecological conversion. Ecological conversion. Now, remember what I said earlier about Laudato Si being widely received and celebrated, but not so much in the American Catholic Church, setting aside the very Franciscan mission Santa Barbara and the now Franciscan St. Mark's University Center. How often do you hear about ecological conversion being preached? I mean, this is what the Pope is asking everyone to do. And yet this is something that, like, when I teach my students about this, it blows their mind. They said, that's what the Pope said? How come no one's ever told me this before? So here's what he says. Here's what Pope Francis says about ecological conversion. The ecological crisis is a summons to a profound interior conversion. It must be said that some committed and prayerful Christians, with the excuse of realism and pragmatism, tend to ridicule expressions of concern for the environment. Others are passive, They choose not to change their habits and thus become inconsistent. So what they all need is an ecological conversion where the effects of their encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around them. Now, I would say that as a Franciscan friar and someone who attempts to be a faithful son of St. Francis of Assisi, that sounds pretty good. And if St. Francis were walking around today in the 21st century, he would probably say, yeah, I want to do that. So Pope Francis says, in calling to mind the figure of St. Francis of Assisi, we come to realize that a healthy relationship with creation is one dimension of an overall personal conversion, which entails the recognition of our errors, sins, and failures, and leads to heartfelt repentance or change of direction, and the desire to change. He says many things can change, but only if we are open to that change. And that's what he's calling us to. This is what the call to moral renewal looks like. This is what a program of ethical renewal looks like. And it's not just for church people. It's not just for Catholics. It's for everyone. Now, this ecological conversion will have these other will find other dimensions. For some people, it will result in civic and political love. That is a commitment to society, a devotion to making the world a better place for other people. And for those who are Catholics or those who practice a sacramental life in their churches, in their faith, Pope Francis articulates in a very compelling way the way in which the sacraments in the Catholic Church allow us, allow nature to help us deepen our relationship with God. So for Catholic, of the universal questions of what is Catholics, of what is eco-spirituality, Pope Francis is saying that here's eco-spirituality, but for those of us that are Catholics, we have these other resources that at our fingertips, that are accessible to us through the practicing of our life in church and in our faith communities. And that nature is both a sign and a symbol, but it's also an occasion for us to be able to access God's grace, for God's grace to access us through our participation in the sacraments. And finally, one of the things that I just, as a Franciscan, I am just delighted to see is that in that same section of chapter 6, Pope Francis talks about God is Trinity. Okay, right? So those of us who've been to any kind of religious education have heard about God as Trinity. Although a lot of preachers tend to avoid preaching about this because they're sort of nervous about explaining it right or making people feel baffled by it. It does have a mysterious dimension to it, but fortunately, we in the Franciscan tradition, and now the whole church, of course, has access to the teaching of a wonderful Franciscan saint named Saint Bonaventure, who's a doctor of the church, and he taught quite extensively and with quite profound religious understanding what Trinity means. And so what Pope Francis is doing is he's pulling from our tradition, our Catholic tradition, and saying this understanding of God as loving interdependent relationship, that notion of three persons in loving relationship with each other, we can see that in small ways in every aspect of the entire created universe. So when I try to explain this to some of my non-Christian, non-religious friends, they sort of scratch their heads and look at me. But I think that for those of us who are interested in questions of faith and the teachings of the New Testament and the gospel, this notion that all of creation is Trinitarian in its design and its structure is really profoundly inspiring, because then everything in the entire world it communicates some aspect of who God is. Now, this is a profound and really mysterious, contemplative, inspiring, beautiful understanding of the relationship between God, creation, and us. And it's really, again, an expression of God's overflowing goodness that that we can see God because we can see pieces of God in nature. So for those who are on an eco-spirituality journey, as Pope Francis has outlined, this teaching about Trinity is really quite remarkable for the Pope to sort of like take this from a 13th century Franciscan teacher and repropose it to us today. I think this is so inspiring and really can help inspire others to undergo this transformation. And I invite you to consider that as well. And just in my last comment here, I will just say, are you on a journey into eco-spirituality? I hope you are. I invite you to be. If you're not, or if you're not sure, what's holding you back from this full, active, and conscious participation in this journey? Are there negative emotions you need to attend to? Is there a greater experience of joy, love, beauty, inspiration that you need to find in creation? What are the spiritual dimensions or the spirituality practices that can help guide you? Pope Francis in chapter 6 presents a kind of idealized program. I think part of what you might consider, if you're interested, is if you're so inclined, is to identify some components of your own journey into eco-spirituality. Again, my hope is that I can inspire everyone to read this little book, which I think is going to be a spiritual classic. It's certainly the problems that it describes in our relationship to the world and the opportunity to undergo this transformation are going to be with us for a while. This is not going to be resolved in a year or two, but I think that this provides guidance, wisdom, and inspiration for all of us. And I thank you for your kind attention, and we'll now turn the talking stick back over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Brother Keith, for unpacking the richness that is there in Laudato Si, and particularly presenting to us these themes of ecological consciousness and conversion. And I'd like to invite our participants to, as Jessica mentioned, pose any questions that you might have for Brother Keith into the chat. Also, Brother Keith, for his part, offered us some questions for us to reflect on. If you just want to respond to any of those, I can pitch them back to Brother Keith for either his own take on it or an expansion of a point. For our first question, Brother Keith, you highlighted chapter 6 in Laudato Si as being really, really central. And this first subsection there is called Towards a New Lifestyle. And you used the phrase gum-chewing Catholics. And I was just wondering, at a certain point, you identified that paragraph where Pope Francis talked about a number of things, concrete things. No one can say that there's nothing for them to do, because there are very, very specific, real things that anyone can do. What would you say are 1 or 3 examples of ways in which we, in the West Coast of the United States, we can even make it that specific, need to move towards a new lifestyle based on what Pope Francis outlines in Laudato Si?
Thank you for that question. Well, I would say one of the kind of the pre-question, or I should say the first step before you even get to the practices, is to then probe our own intentions and what is important to us. So that's, I think, starting with that kind of interior reflection and say, what are the things that are holding me back? What do I feel called to do is the first step. So that's a kind of growing in self-awareness and doing so in a way, in the context I would propose, of prayer, so that God's wisdom might guide us. Then I would say that for Laudato Si, the steps need to be thought of as trying out different aspects of what he proposes. So I would say there's an important aspect of reflection, but there's also a really important part of just trying to do things that will, and seeing what works well and what brings meaning and joy, and what you're good at and what you're not good at. I've always liked the title of Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography, that he described it as the story of my experiments with truth. And he narrates a whole series of trial and error experiments to see what could he do that would foster the kind of world that he really believed in. And so in this context, it would involve reducing consumption, reducing fossil fuel use in any way possible, thinking about people who are finding ways to be able to do engage with concrete practices that serve the poor, because they're a part of this too. And I would also say that those kind of practices that involve a simplification of our lifestyle, getting by with less resource consumption for sure. But at the same time, I think part of the message of Laudato Si is also to relish nature. And having spent a good bit of time in Santa Barbara and enjoying San Diego County at present, I would have to say, like, not all at once, but you should love the beaches because they're just so amazing and beautiful, and the backcountry hiking, and the air, and the beautiful mountains that are around us. So again, there are concrete acts of simplicity of our lifestyle, of compassion for our neighbor, but also celebrating in the spirit of Francis's love and praise of God found in creation, that all can be accessible to everyone. And so setting out on trying these different practices out, of finding out what works, and then continuing to refine them. I would recommend that would be a good place to start.
In your response there too, you hit on self-awareness, and within one's own reflection on one's interior life and in relation to the exterior world, one is led from simply looking within to looking without and seeing the whole. Is there anything that you could offer about, by way of this contrast between people who seem just indifferent, right? You're aware of it, but other people don't seem to get what's going on. Have you found any ways of kind of brokering this dialogue, this exchange, even amongst those who are religious, who are religious Catholics, who just seem like, well, it's, until climate change it comes in and swallows one of my children like a whale, I don't really care.
Yeah. Well, by the time that happens, it's probably too late for us as human beings, unfortunately. But I understand the problem of which you speak. So I think that I have often felt that cynicism is a response of a frustrated idealist, and I feel that sometimes. So I think that helping people to take concrete actions, put that into virtue practice, that will begin to give people a sense of their own power to do good. I would also say that that sometimes these negative attitudes of fear many of these the attitudes that Pope Francis talked about. Let me just sort of run through them again, because they're worth recognizing. They're a big part of what's holding us back as a human community. Fear, narcissism, indifference, and denial. Now, not necessarily fear, but the others might be considered sins. And I think we Franciscans maybe have a slightly different take on sin, because we don't want to use shame. No shame, won't be helpful here, but invite people to undergo change from their sin, and to say that you can make other choices. God wills that you would be free by choosing to become more consciously loving in participating in God's plan for human beings in relationship to nature. But I understand why all those negative experiences or negative attitudes are what people wear on their exterior. But I think that the fear part, the fear of feeling pain and also feeling that they can't do anything. Those are like deep heart interior experiences that people have that can, when we watch something as a bystander and we feel we can't do anything, it causes us pain, and we develop a kind of an emotional scar tissue to prevent us from feeling that way again. And so I think that's happening at a broad social level as we look at the problems of climate change, and we're just like overwhelmed and freaked out, and the wildfires and the floods and the droughts and and the climate refugees, and we're just like, I can't deal with it anymore. But then this is, part of the journey into ecological consciousness means confronting the very real pain that millions of people, especially poor people, are confronting in terms of, having their houses flooded and having their crops fail and being dislocated, like having an open-eyed view of that terrible injustice that these people are suffering. Their humanity is being degraded, and species and whole ecosystems, coral systems are in dire, really dire situation and may not make it. We have to allow that pain into us to motivate us to change. And I think if we look at the example of our Father, St. Francis, and how he went to where the pain was, to where the lepers who were ostracized by society were, and he saw in them the kind of redemptive suffering of Jesus and experienced a profound interior conversion. And I think that you might agree, you tell me if you do, that we as Franciscans believe that profound conversion is possible if we open ourselves to the grace of God. So all of those things are designed to sort of like help us kind of staunch the pain, but in fact, they end up being blocking us from the grace of being invited to that profound interior conversion. How's that sound, Father Ryan?
It makes total sense. What you are proposing is totally consistent with what Pope Francis has articulated, that it's actually practice, or perhaps better said, praxis, that it is educational in terms of we have to understand something. That's probably no doubt his Jesuit side coming through, but where he's tapping his Franciscan side is that it is experiential. It is in the doing. It is God is constantly acting. And in the example of Francis too, he didn't have a great revelation while on his sickbed like Ignatius of Loyola. He went out, and it was amongst the lepers where he experienced the conversion that you described, and then was inspired to live out the gospel in a very tangible, real, and broken system. It wasn't because everything was good that he was then inspired to go and do better. And I was thinking, based on what some people have written, is you've had a lot of experiences with different groups, working with different groups, whether that was at Santa Clara, whether it's now with the Franciscans, whether it's being a superior in a Franciscan household. What would be a good program, or what have you seen worked to get us not just to do the educational thing with talks and speakers, but as a parish community, as a center of evangelization, as a family? What do you have any best practices or ideas on what could I do to just get the ball rolling?
Great, thanks. Yes. So I think experience can really be helpful here, and I think that the environment as a kind of intellectual category can end up being debated, and then can result in just sort of kind of circular arguments, just kind of back and forth going and without getting something. And what I think is, what I think experience can break through some of the ideological deadlocks, roadblocks that we experience. One of the panelists talked about very religious Catholics who are in denial. I think it depends how far into denial people are, and so finding people that you think you have the chance of that are somewhat more persuadable might be easier than just sort of taking on the most difficult. But I would say that in all these things, helping people to have an experience of nature as creation, of nature as our sister and mother, as St. Francis talked about it, or nature as the source of our life. Pope Francis in chapter 3 critiques the radical anthropocentrism that seems to be running around many people's ways of thinking, their philosophies today, in which human beings are the only thing that God cares about, and that nothing in the material or biological or ecological world matters. It's just like, that's not true. God loves the earth. God created it. It expresses who God is. How could God not care about the earth? It's God's fingerprints on every single molecule and gene and everything in the whole world reflects who God is. I mean, to say otherwise is to deny the Bible. And to say somehow or other that creation isn't present in every sacrament of the church is a lie, and it's an illusion. But arguing with people is not going to get us very far. I think we need to take them outside. I think we need to take them outside and have them have a sensory experience of nature. And here again, I would point to our father, Saint Francis, who really did not, his reflection on the beauty and goodness of creation emerged from his sensory experience of it, not, frankly, from reading a papal encyclical. I do think it's very valuable to do this, but I think that doing this in dialogue with an experience of touching earth, of having your feet in the ocean, of getting knocked down by a wave, of going up to the top of a mountain, of being away from technology, of being able to watch a plant grow that can produce food that can feed you. These are all experiences that are forms of communion that help us understand communion with nature in a way that helps us understand a little bit more about, well, the whole Pope Francis quotes Pope Benedict, who quotes Teilhard de Chardin, who talks about the Eucharist is celebrated on the altar of the world. The altar of the world is where the bread is broken and Christ becomes visible to us. How can we say that we don't need the earth when the popes are telling us we celebrate the Eucharist on the altar of the world? We've polluted the sanctuary, and we're called by God, Jesus Christ, and Pope Francis to convert. So finding ways to invite people into those experiences will help this. Notice it's not called, I'm not saying that the Pope Francis is calling us to a journey into eco-theology, although I teach eco-theology, I think it's great. But it's not the best way to engage people who are in denial, seduced by the lies of Fox News, and people who are so kind of traditional that they have a completely distorted understanding of the tradition, which goes back 150 years and ignores the wisdom that God has given to us over the entire sweep of salvation history. So finding ways to give people those experiences, I recommend that.
As it were, in your answer and your description, what I was thinking is that when dealing with difficult people or approaching the topic, we don't want to say, take a hike. We want to take them on a hike.
Hey, there you go. And preferably with a small community, not by themselves, because part of the illusion, the pernicious illusion that results in this kind of why should I care about the earth? I'm Catholic kind of thinking is rooted in this hyper individualistic approach to faith in American religions, including Catholicism, which are part of the lie, because the whole point of an ecological spirituality is to foster interdependent relationships with other people and with the earth and fundamentally with God.
It's in that way that both your comments and Pope Francis cut across the narrative of I'll just say a loose spirituality, where people, I'm sure you've heard them reflect, say, oh, I just love being in nature. This is when I feel most present with God, and I really don't need a church. Whereas the authentic tradition is that, in fact, there can be no individual experience of the divine. That it is all geared towards community, as expressed in God's own nature, as God is. 3 and 1 in an inherent relationship.
Yes, in fact, the whole Yes, you're referring to two illusions. One is that I can experience nature by myself apart from God, and that God's not somehow not present. And the other is that I can just have my own experience of God by myself, which is part of what leads to this kind of distorted understanding of what God's calling us to.
And by way of closing, you and I are brothers. We're friars minor. We're in this order together. And that's part of what Francis did, is that his own personal experience led him to God, to others, and to this dynamic that is part of our life, part of our spirituality, what it means to be friars minor. One of your at various points, you've touched on the figure of Francis, and it's only natural because yesterday was his feast day, October 4th. Happy feast to everyone. And I say to everyone here gathered because it's most likely that at some level, whether it's through Mission Santa Barbara, whether it's just the power of St. Francis's life and legacy, are touched, influenced, at least inspired by. He's presented, going back to Pope St. John Paul II, all the way to Pope Francis, as a type of universal saint in terms of his attraction. All saints are universal in that they are geared to God, who is the Father of all. But Francis has a particular attraction really across boundaries. And Brother Keith, I know one of your articles early on in your career was get him out of the bird bath. And I was wondering if you want to just give us one aspect of what you see, one dimension of St. Francis's life for us to think, reflect on, take with us, if it can summarize the themes, the ideas that you've talked about today. Pope Francis talks about. How might we just look to St. Francis as a type of inspiration for what we've unpacked right here?
I would say that I first fell in love with St. Francis by watching a movie which was kind of inspired by him, but was maybe distorted a few things, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. I found it very helpful. But I also found that I watched it a few times while I was in the process of spending 5 years working in tree planting for a reforestation co-op where I planted 500,000 trees. And this was back in the 80s. And the reason why I share that story is because back then, I intuitively kind of understood that, like, there's got to be what we're doing to the earth and what our obligations to care for the earth, because it cares for us. It seemed like they should be religious. And back then, 35 years ago, people kind of looked at me like, well, that's sort of a new idea. It's like, well, no, it's a really old idea. It needs to be renewed. And I think that's what Pope Francis is trying to do here. And so that became kind of an inspiration, and really my first experience of experiencing a call that would lead me to Franciscan life. And I remember a conversation with my vocation director, Brother James Lockman, who was very sympathetic, supportive of what I was doing and still is. And he said, well, I think it's really great that you're interested in doing that, but you're probably going to have to find your own path, because we don't have like a thing for you to go do. There's no ministry or job that exists back then. I said, that's okay. I'll help figure it out. And so never in my wildest imagination, when I became a friar some 30-something years ago, did I imagine that the Pope would be writing this and putting, basically, get out of my head. You wrote it all down in my encyclical. And another brother, who some of you may know, Brother Bill Short, after this came out, so maybe 2015 or 16, I said, Bill, I think it's really great that Pope Francis is saying all of these things. But you know what? I was saying them 25, 30 years ago, and no one paid attention to me. And he looked at me as he stepped out the door with a little wink. He said, yes, but you don't have a white hat. So for all of those out there in Zoom land, thank you for listening. I would just say that what matters is ultimately is not what the Pope says or what Brother Keith says, but what your own experience of God and your journey into God's mercy, grace, love, and this journey of eco-spirituality and growing in your own ecological awareness. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the roots take take root, and that's where your spirit can learn to love God in creation and the poor all at once. And I wish all of you the Lord's peace.
Truly, Brother Keith, thank you so much. Jessica, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Father Ryan, and thank you very much, Brother Keith. I really appreciate both of your presence this evening, and thank you to all of our attendees. I just dropped a link in our chat if you would like to donate to help support programs like this one. And a second link that I just dropped is the link to our speaker series. Our third talk for the speaker series is next Wednesday at the same time. And we have Cassandra Carmichael, who will be moderating, and she will be talking with a few local spiritual leaders of various faiths, and we'll be continuing the conversation about climate change. Thank you all for joining so much. I really appreciate you. Please have a beautiful evening. Thank you.